is preparing your users. So industry sources indicate that over the next 5 years, utilities are going to undergo more change than they have in the previous 50 years. Billions of dollars are being spent in smart grid infrastructure for power, water, electric. And so similar expenditures are occurring across all of these industries. And so as you probably already know, Esri released the Utility Network Management Framework to production in early 2019. The UN is not a version change, but rather a transformation in line with these broader industry changes. So the UN technology modernization effort is meant to bring modern IT best practices to network management. Its primary distinguishing characteristics are services-oriented architecture, the business logic embedded within the database, and cross-platform support. And note too that Esri officially announced 10.8.1 is the last release of ArcMap, and it will be unsupported after March 2026. So organizations will need to migrate to ArcGIS Pro and the utility network for their network management framework. And then UN also brings the capability to model, edit, and analyze these complex network systems that are also in the ground. So most of the advanced functions of its predecessor, the geometric network, were limited to that desktop environment, and that's not the case with the UN. It's also going to produce a high fidelity data model, allowing more granular and more accurate capture of both the linear and vertical assets. And these can be captured using containment and associations, which will allow for advanced tracing while also not cluttering the map in very dense areas. And so while the geometric network has served well for over 20 years, the UN is expected to provide the technological foundation for the next 2 decades. So modern workflows really require mobility. Common devices like smartphones today weren't even around when the geometric network came to be. The UN is designed to support network functionality across the entire Esri platform, whether desktop, web, or native apps, and truly, looking at it, any device, anywhere, at any time. This is embedded through a service-oriented architecture, ArcGIS Pro, ArcGIS Enterprise, feature services, and geoprocessing tools. The services architecture matches efforts across other technology best practices you already use every day, such as banking. And network management will now follow the same methodologies. A high fidelity data model allows for more granular and accurate real-world representations of the assets. With explicit connectivity rules, asset directionality, terminals, containment, and association, managers and operators can expect data to function like its physical counterpart during analysis. And finally, with all of these rules, Esri is trying to make it hard for users to make bad data. With business logic in the database, configurable levels of tracing, and 3D support for the vertical assets, this is really the next generation of network management. So really, looking at that, a lot of people are really struggling to understand the full magnitude and impact of implementing the utility network. One of the big things that we get asked a lot is to help them communicate, better to the organizational executives in order to gain support for this transition. After all, we can just pull up a map, right? What's the big deal? We've offered some of the following analogies to help our clients establish additional justification and business support for implementing this new technology platform. So really converting from the geometric network to the ArcGIS utility network, as I mentioned several times, it's a technology transformation, much like the conversion from a flip phone to a smartphone most of us did many years ago. Some things are rather familiar while supported by a completely different foundational structure. The smartphone conversion is an analogy that's resonated with many of our clients regarding what the implementation of the utility network entails and the purpose behind the transformation. On a flip phone, you text using a multi-tap process on the number pad. Do you remember how in order to spell GIS, you had to press the 4 key once, wait, hit the 4 key 3 times, etc. Then came predictive text, and we would tap 447 to get GIS. On the smartphone, you can type away via a familiar keyboard layout to a touch screen. And since the initial release, we can now swipe our finger along the keyboard, or even use voice recognition. On the flip phone, you made phone calls, perhaps had a few simple apps like a calculator and a couple of card games. Today, you have access to a camera, video, your email, a full app store, multiplayer games, and location-based services. In the old day, we had to call for pizza and memorize the local cab company's phone number. In today's smartphone app store, we can order pizza through the app on our phone, even watch the status of a delivery driver as he approaches our location, and we can catch a ride with apps such as Uber and Lyft from just about anywhere and pay seamlessly. So while everything on your flip phone was stored primarily on the physical SIM card, cloud storage and services now allow you to sync across your devices and your platforms, seamlessly transitioning the work from your smartphone that you started to your laptop or your tablet. And the information is really instantly available across all your other connected devices. And finally, on the flip phone, we had simple contacts, a name, maybe a couple of phone numbers. The smartphone enriches these contracts with addresses, email, photos, social media accounts, relationships. You know, this is the database migration required for implementing the UN. It's only a part of the technical transition. Note, while the database migration is indeed part of this technical transition, it's really just a part of the process, but the conversion is also going to enrich your data with new capability that was not possible before. This is really one of the key takeaways here. And the UN will require that data migration. The primary reason is to support the new technology capabilities. And so there are a number of resources out there to compare the specific technical differences between the geometric network and the utility network. You know, we've covered them before in a lot of previous webinars at GISinc. So if you're interested, you can find those out on our website. They're free to watch and view. But the geometric network most of us use today predates the smartphone and is being asked to support workflows, which it was never intended. And so this modernization effort to align utility management with modern technology best practices is really the route that everybody's going. And so there's also one of the things to think about is there will be some familiar capabilities supported by completely different technology bases as well. So implementation of the utility network is really a paradigm shift and not, as I mentioned, that the traditional data model migration. So as you can see in the geometric network, there is database capabilities, database level access, post-edit data quality checks, multiple functional codes via applications and distributed deployments. And in the utility network, this is really more of a software product. As I mentioned, it's the services-based architecture. So taking that away from, that database level access. One of the other great things is you're going to be able to quality check your data before you even save it within your system. And then, of course, there is a centralized deployment. And then, as I mentioned, the explicit geometric and logical connectivity between the data. In the geometric network would allow you to use the full network traces. And one of the great things about the utility network is now you're really going to be able to model and support those sub networks. So as the utility network is this substantial effort, transitioning to the UN, no matter the organizational scale, is generally going to follow the same progression from initial assessment and preparation phases through final testing and deployment. So the pathway, while it's going to remain the same, the magnitude and complexity of the individual steps and the duration are going to vary substantially across each organization. So the data workflows that begin with the data readiness assessment to explore the present state of your data and result in recommendations on initial data quality findings will allow your organization to begin an iterative data cleansing process. The database design is going to follow that to include data mapping, database builds, migration tool configurations, and initial migration testing. Within the more technical workflows, technical readiness assessments evaluate the state of your present architecture and your business system integrations, resulting in recommendations for your final architecture design. And so part of the database phase is going to Consider these external business system dependencies that you have and existing solutions that are already in place. And then, of course, at that point, we also want to recommend that your key stakeholders who are going to be editing and working with the data in the utility network to really begin any formal Esri training as early as possible through this process. And so with the planning and design efforts completed, we generally recommend beginning implementation with one or more pilots on each of your networks. The pilots will focus on that initial data migration, any build errors that appear, the UN configurations, schema adjustments, workflows, and any adjustments that need to be made, as well as any performance tuning. And then finally, when everything is over, you're going to start with your end user training. Go through any user acceptance training prior to that final data migration, ultimately getting you there to your system go live. And so, as I mentioned, the magnitude is going to vary across organization to organization, but this process will remain relatively the same for organizations as you migrate to the utility network. And just remember that the data cleansing process, as we mentioned, that's going to be iterative throughout the entire process as you move forward. So really, it's important to consider whether your organization is ready to implement the utility network. So, we've really outlined a couple of things to start asking yourself. Looking at the versions that you have deployed, if you do have ArcGIS Enterprise, your readiness to make that shift to ArcGIS Pro. One thing I do want to mention is there is single user database support available for the UN for very small organizations. So definitely, if you feel that you fall into that category, talk to your Esri account manager about that. The other thing is looking at your data. Do you already have a standardized data model that you're utilizing? Looking at the size of your data. Do you understand what business processes and workflows go on within your organization? Do you have a lot of field users yet? If not, is that the direction you're looking to go? Are there other systems, third-party systems that you're already integrated with? Are they going to be able to support getting the data through the services architecture? And are there any other, including with that, even asset management and looking at the different ones and how they want to consume that data, as well as just storing the assets as a whole. But really, one of the big things is your organization going to be prepared to focus on the utility network implementation? This is going to be a time commitment. So making sure that stakeholders and technical staff are going to be available, as well as have the skills required for the implementation. And then really looking at that as far as, what that time frame is going to look like. So moving forward, I really want to spend some time to talk a little bit about lessons learned and through experience with implementing the utility network for water with some of our customers. So the first thing to note is, as I mentioned, this is a new technology platform. And so it's important for you to understand ArcGIS Enterprise and the entire stack at that. Once published, all interaction is going to be through services. So your database, your ArcGIS server, portal, your network, they all need to be tuned for heavy geoprocessing services. And also, when it inevitably comes time to troubleshoot an issue, you're going to need to know where to isolate and focus your attention. So note that when implementing the UN, you now have to consider what version you're on for Enterprise, what version of Pro you're on, as well as the release of the utility network. So those are going to be three things, making sure that you have the compatibility there. And, really what functionality is supported in the implementation needs to be considered as well. Thankfully, Esri is really, looking to change the deployment pattern so that ArcGIS Server rather than Pro is going to determine what version of the UN is deployed. And that's really going to simplify a lot of things. And really in response to questions about how to architect the UN, Esri is going to tell you there's not really anything special to architect specifically for the UN. The important point is that you should architect for heavy use of feature services in the geo processing, as I mentioned earlier. And so, that's really going to mean lots of core and lots of RAM. And you need to make sure that your desktop users have sufficient resources, particularly the GPUs on their graphic card to support ArcGIS Pro. So when it comes to, preparation as well, there are a few other things to consider. First is the existing published data models. Those are a really good starting point to look at. And of course, one thing we do want to stress is they're not considered to be the final authoritative design, and it is expected that organizations are going to extend or localize as needed to support your specific needs. And as part of the initial planning steps, you also might want to consider what foundational templates are out there as a way to prototype the schemas. But as we mentioned, one of the most important things you can also do is to clean your source data. If you've not already done so, Esri's data reviewer can be used to identify errors and issues in the source data prior to migrating any of your data into the utility network. Certain errors will prevent features from loading in the first place, and others, of course, may not even appear until you're ready to start activating subnetworks. So clean up your data now as much as you possibly can. And one thing I do want to also stress, I know I've been talking a lot about how this is a major implementation, but we have also seen a lot of success with smaller organizations implementing the UN with their own staff while having a technical coach or guide through the entire process. So I do want to stress, we are seeing a lot of organizations that are able to successfully implement this on their own. And really just kind of having that overall guide to help walk them through exactly what the process is and providing reach back support as needed. And another thing to, consider is really, if you simplify the data model and utilizing a coach, your organization could potentially reduce the total implementation cost significantly. But some organizations are also trading some business system downtime for reduced complexity by having a single cutover rather than, trying to avoid any downtime with external business systems. So really the biggest thing is, make sure that you're planning for these implementations, and, you can even test it out in a dedicated development environment as well to help reduce that downtime, as well as making sure that if you do have any other system integrations, that everything is going to work flawlessly. And so, on the implementation, as I mentioned, we really want to make sure that you look at this as needing a focused effort. This is a technology platform transformation, not just a simple data migration. And that's one of the things that, I think we really can't stress enough. So making sure that your staff are dedicated to the project as much as possible to reduce risk and shorten implementation timeframes. And, as I mentioned, as we were going through the process, one of the things that we do recommend is multiple pilot implementations. Two at the very least to hash out any design and business rules, and then potentially even one more for your user training before you do your final implementation. And really considering, and reconsidering what workflows you already have. The editing process and versioning hierarchy in the UN is different than what your staff are used to, and the QA/QC is inherently handled by the system in many cases. So database concepts like topology, dirty areas, subnetwork updates can be foreign to some utility users, and they are things that are going to need to be incorporated into the new workflows. So also, in addition, unlike present workflows, users are going to have access to the same functionality, whether they're on a desktop or a mobile device. And so these new workflows should definitely be considered and determine how they can be adopted within your organization. And another important thing to consider is, that allowable downtime for your system cutover. So there, as you work through these different business system integrations, definitely consider that. And, we'll talk about in a second, there are a lot of tools out there that can help you also running kind of parallel environments for your geometric network to your utility network while you're going through the implementation. And really, one of the big things is Esri is also improving a lot of their documentation and their communication. We've also found that in addition to the Esri technical support, the GeoNet community forums are a great resource. And we're able to find answers directly provided by the Esri technical teams or other people in the community that have already gone through their implementations there. So we really, encourage becoming familiar with GeoNet if you haven't already. But Esri, as well as a lot of other partners like GISinc, also have a lot of blogs, webinars, updates that are out there and available for free. So real quick, moving through, getting started. The path for the UN is going to be very similar for organizations. There are many different implementation strategies, that you can consider. And so really, determine what the data migration strategy is going to be for your organization. As I mentioned, SSP-Sync is a tool out there. They're one of our partners where you can run the geometric network and the utility network together while you are working, to keep them both up to date while you are working on your implementation before you go live. Esri also has a lot of data loading tools that can be utilized. And if you have FME, there are also some, you can utilize workbenches for that. But, really, one of the biggest things is, approaching, is this something your organization is going to do by yourself? Are you looking to work with a partner? There are a lot of jump starts out there to help you quickly get started, get some of your data migrated, and then be able to take on the rest of the implementation within your organization. And of course, as I also mentioned, there's technical coaching and assistance out there, as well as full implementation support. So really, looking to see what's the best for your organization, as well as, considering those timelines and budget constraints. And another thing that I just want to mention real quick is, there's been a lot of talk about stimulus funding. There's the American Recovery Plan Act. There's lots of money that's out there that's available to local governments. And so in the American Recovery Plan Act, one of the eligible uses is investing in the water and sewer infrastructure. And so that is certainly one of the cases where you can utilize that funding to assist in your utility network implementation. And then, a lot of that money is also really being funneled directly to local cities and counties. There's another round coming out. There's a lot of infrastructure stimulus bills out there that we are expecting to continue to pass as well in the near future. So definitely, there's some funding options out there that are outside of your traditional funding. So, definitely take a look and see if that's something that your organization is going to be able to utilize. So I really appreciate everybody joining today to let me take a quick dive in the utility network. And I hope you learned a little bit about the process that you can take back as you plan for your organization. As I mentioned, this is one of the topics that we talk about a lot at GISinc. So we do have a couple of webinars and information out there if you would like to dig in a little bit more on the implementation or learn a little bit more about the stimulus funding.
Thank you, Wendy. We certainly appreciate that. So does anybody out there have any questions for Wendy they would like to ask via chat, or actually unmute themselves so we can hear your voice? I noticed just when I assume we don't have a question, questions come in. So I'm going to wait just one more minute.
Hi, Wendy. Thanks for that that detailed overview. Is very helpful. Can you talk a little bit about some of the challenges of the back-end IT infrastructure to get this thing implemented?
So one of the big challenges that we have seen is really just the current infrastructure that some organizations have. One of the big things that you're going to need is a testing environment. As you're going through the pilot projects, pushing the data, that is one of the big recommendations. And so, we recommend there are two ways that you can start breaking this down to hit that, but, really doing a technology assessment, looking at your current infrastructure, looking at what you're going to need to support it, as well as, the big piece is, editing is going to be taking place in ArcGIS Pro. A lot of local governments may be on a 2-year, 3-year, 5-year cycle for replacing, the desktop equipment for some of their users. And so starting to, look and see what the organization is going to need and get that into the plan, because that is going to affect the timeline. But one of the things that, we want to stress, over the next couple of years as organizations are moving forward, that is going to be one of the things that's going to be considered. But throughout this entire process, you can go ahead and start editing your data and cleaning up your data and preparing that. So there are a lot of things that you can do simultaneously, because if it's going to take you getting into the next budget year in order to, beef up your infrastructure, then, as long as you're working on your data editing, that can also shorten, the overall span of implementing the utility network. Steve, I think you're on mute again.
Okay, now I'm losing. It's getting toward the end of the day. What can I say? So